Hi, everybody. This is going to be a fairly informal discussion of some issues that your professors at Trent have been thinking about in relationship to the current pandemic and crisis. We are all, in the same situation as everybody else, working at home and learning different skills. We all have concerns as well. We have anxieties around friends and family members, and we realize that our students and our colleagues do as well, and people in the community, particularly at the moment our healthcare workers. So we're trying to offer some not light relief, but some distraction or relief from the constant news cycle. Perhaps give people 20 minutes to kind of step out of the current conditions of anxiety and think a bit more broadly, and we're hoping that that brings some contribution to our wider community. So my name is Momin Rahman, and I'm in the Sociology department here at Trent, and I have a couple of colleagues today joining me for this discussion, and I'm just going to let them introduce themselves. So first we have Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Siena. I'm an historian of medicine. I specialize in 17th, 18th century, but focus primarily on the history of infectious diseases and class.
Thanks, Kevin. And Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate Norlock, and I'm the Kenneth Mark Drain Chair in Ethics at Trent, and I'm a full professor in the philosophy department.
Thanks, Kate. So, and thanks to both of you for joining us. We are really just going to talk, I think, in fairly, unstructured ways about things that we've been thinking about and things that we hope will have some resonance for you as an audience. And I started this conversation, first of all, by, asking our colleagues about anxiety. And one of the things that struck me is that, I'm very anxious. I'm partly anxious because I have a very elderly mother back in the UK who's increasingly grumpy, not being able to go out and particularly see her grandchildren. So that's one end of it. But I also have a niece who is an administrator in a large hospital in London in the UK. And although she's, happy to be at work, I'm pretty anxious about whether she should be there or not. And at some level, I realize that's selfish because, she's helping a really important service, but it's that personalized anxiety. But I was also thinking and reminded of the idea of general social anxiety, and in sociology about 20 years ago, this idea of kind of risk anxiety had developed, and it was a theory that really talked about the fact that in modern life we become so specialized and it becomes so technologized that we're dependent upon experts, people who know how to do things that we don't know how to do. And the classic example was like, we expect the pilot to know how to fly the plane, and the plane flies itself a lot of the time. And I wondered whether part of what we're having right now is a period in which that anxiety that we'd have to trust in these expert systems has really been laid bare, right? Because all of the expert systems around the world are being deployed, and particularly our medical professionals. But there's also a sense in which, they may have failed, and this is not the medical profession, but really the governance systems, that they maybe weren't quick enough to work out what was going on. They weren't quick enough to, tell us, how to control this. And that's not to raise any criticisms of any particular government, but it's, I think, just part of the generalized lack of control that we're feeling. And part of that lack of control is that normally we just cede control to these systems and we trust in them. And maybe that's been part of what's happening in terms of anxiety. But I think there are other perspectives on that. And I'm not sure that, that's the only way to kind of think about it. So this is why I think it's useful for us to have some different perspectives. So first of all, I wanted to ask, Kevin about this as a historian in terms of the knowledge we have from previous pandemics or epidemics around how people react to anxiety or even incidents of panic.
This has been this has been really fascinating. I never really wanted to be relevant before. I studied the 17th century, and it's safe back there, and just nerds are interested in it. But suddenly, there's been all kinds of discussions among historians of medicine, because it suddenly seemed like, oh my God, this is our moment, because people are suddenly asking,
right,
what do we do? What the heck is this? We've been one of the groups of people who've been like, well, we have actually been looking at what happens when these things have played out. One of the things that really struck me, but before this, going into this, but this has really heightened it, is just how currently there tends not to be the same kind of historical memory about epidemics that previous societies kind of held to longer. So, for example, I tell my students every year, anywhere from 50 to maybe even 100 million people died in the Spanish flu pandemic after the First World War, and they really don't know what I'm talking about. Typically,
right.
they know about the First World War, but in terms of casualties, the flu pandemic was far worse, and that didn't get registered in the same way as this key event that gets codified and talked about in schools, right, and all the rest. And that is a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, I think that it has to do with the stunning success of medicine in the 20th century. So that, antibiotics and the success of vaccine after vaccine. So you get to a point, right, where we I think we've let our guard down a bit, like in the sense that, we don't, that really is old history. The idea that a disease can sort of spread around and kill that many people, that we don't have to worry about diseases in the same way. Polio and these things are just something of the past. But if we look at, so for off the bat, the fact that we haven't held to the history of these events as closely maybe might be one of the things that has allowed us to be sort of caught off guard nowadays. But if you look at epidemics, they're fascinating windows historically, because societies show you everything. They show you what they are made of at that moment. It's the best of times and the worst of times. So in terms of in terms of anxiety and risk, senses of risk and anxiety, you do see panic in epidemics, and one of the things you see is that people who can flee cities will flee cities. They will run away. One of the most common reactions is just to run away. So when plague hits, European cities from the Middle Ages and through the end of through the 18th century, the people who can run away can run away, but you immediately see who has resources and who doesn't. So you need to be able to go to your house in the countryside or to rent land. You need to be able to have a horse to get out of the city, and a lot of people, of course, can't do that. And we're seeing today, there have been reports of folks I grew up on Long Island, and there are reports of folks who are fleeing Manhattan at the start of this and hopping in their SUVs full of all the food they can carry and driving out to the Hamptons, which is at the easternmost tip of Long Island. It's where there's lots of mansions where rich people have their, the equivalents of their cottages out there. And the local community in early March, I mean, this is a summertime economy where people go out there to be on the beaches in the summer. Right. So the stores are not full of food. Right. And all these folks have rushed out there and bought up all the food in the grocery stores, and so they have a little tiny hospital out there. And the locals are also saying, not only can we not support this population right now, if you guys are getting sick, if you're coming from Manhattan, so they're worried about the people coming in and bringing disease to this more remote community. Yeah, and they're saying, the hospitals here, the hospital here can't handle what might be be coming for this. And there have been some reports up here in Ontario about similar kinds of things playing themselves out in cottage country as folks want to get out of a place like Toronto.
Yeah.
As far as if you're going to be anxious, you need to think about what you have to process. What should I be anxious about? And then that is based upon the information you have and how you process that information and the ideas and things that you already have floating around in your mind. And everybody's making, decisions with incomplete data and such. But one of the things that we see in the history of epidemics is prejudices play themselves out. So people making assumptions about who is more likely to carry disease, what neighborhoods in a city are more dangerous. There are really rich histories when you get the third plague pandemic in the turn of the 20th century. There's pretty striking anti-Asian prejudice in places like San Francisco because you have an outbreak of plague in the city, and the perception is that this has come from the Pacific and that it's hitting, sort of Chinatown in San Francisco. So they will set up, boundaries, they will cordon off Chinatown, and they won't allow, white people can go in and out, but Chinese residents can't leave. And in Honolulu, they actually try to do some controlled burning of buildings to try to contain it. And they burn Chinatown and Honolulu to the ground. And there's debate about whether or not this was an accident, that the fire just got out of control, or whether this was a way of dealing with the population that they perceived to be a risk, right?
And we're seeing those, I think, we're more attuned to, that kind of othering is often the phrase that we use in social sciences and humanities, that we construct this idea of a threatening other. And we're seeing all of those things that you're talking about playing out now. So the advice from the government in Ontario about people not going to their cottages precisely because they're going to actually create a drain on resources for those communities and potentially infect them. So, that's important advice for people to pay heed to and recognize that, that is an instinct that we have seen throughout history, as Kevin demonstrated. And also this idea that, Trump has been promoting of the Chinese virus, right, or the Wuhan virus. And I think a couple of days ago, the vice president in the US also argued that, they were a bit behind the curve because of dealing with it, because the Chinese hadn't been truthful with them about the virus. So, those kind of patterns, it's at one level reassuring to see, to see those patterns exist throughout history, in the sense that we know that, they will happen and we can deal with them. And I guess that gives us a sense of confidence. It's also slightly depressing because it's like, well, maybe in a period of anxiety, like you say, prejudices or, a focus on maybe groups that are already regarded as vulnerable or not really worthy becomes like part of what's happening. I love the stuff that you said about social memory and that we don't have the recollection of that, because one of the tensions in my family sort of growing up, and it's not a tension that's huge, but it's around eating lots at particular meals. So my family are from Bangladesh, and my mum's generation are from Bangladesh, and grew up, in sort of post-war India, and then it becomes Pakistan, East Pakistan, and then Bangladesh. And the approach to eating a meal is like, eat lots and lots and lots and lots, and over, like I said, every time I go visit them, and me and my partner go, like, we're we can't cope with the amount of food. And there's this idea that, and I know that this is true in lots of different cultural communities who have traditionally been poor. And there's a literal memory in my mum's generation of times of famine in Bangladesh. And but I grew up in the UK and never experienced that, and I can't process that, right? I can't process that the world could actually have been like that, so I don't imagine that that's at all possible in our kind of, going from the UK to living in a rich country like Canada. We just don't think about that, right? And really resonated with me in terms of we don't, you know, they also suffered through lots of, you know, different epidemics, and, you know, that's just not in our life experience, either in Canada. So Kate, I was wondering what, like both Kevin and I have at some level painted a picture of, you know, the anxieties and the negativity, but I was wondering what you thought about this from the perspective of kind of ethics and philosophy.
Yeah, I was thinking about a lot of things while Kevin was talking, because I agree with him that we sort of forget these lessons of history. And that's something that in the humanities and social sciences, we all share this sort of unfortunate knowledge that we have this idea that we're always progressing and getting better and better, but that the lessons of history, they're really contingent, right? They actually have to be taught. It's not automatic that you learn from history. You have to teach those lessons. Right. And what we see is that every new generation has to relearn them or not. And that kind of depends on somebody teaching you and lessons being carried forward. I think we're often really bad at that. So right. I can't blame the youngest generations for not learning from history if we don't teach them everything that we could. And I think one of the reasons is because ethics it's an ethos, right? It's a habit. There are habits of thinking. And you either teach those habits of thinking or you don't teach those habits. But in the absence of habits of thinking that are learned, what you operate on is instinct. And that's why, you know, if your parents teach you habits of this is what we do in times of trouble and epidemic, then you have those habits too. And if they don't teach you those habits of thinking, if you don't take them in and embody them, that's not your ethic. So I have been thinking about ethics a lot, listening to you two talk. It's been really nice to see how our disciplinary conventions dovetail. Like we do a lot of the same things and learn from each other, I think. And I was telling you guys before, I think the history of ethics is quite reassuring in this respect. I do think that there is a sort of conventional understanding that in times of emergency or trouble, ethics goes out the window and it's every man for himself. And I'm really happy that the good news from the history of ethics is that is not actually what happens. Right. That in the history of ethics, in times of trouble and emergency, even in the worst situations, even when I do Holocaust studies, what we find is that in the most dire circumstances, some people do act selfishly and hoard and look out for themselves, and other people do act compassionately and look out for each other. And a lot of people do both. They sporadically act sometimes selfishly and sometimes compassionately. So the good news is that it's never the case that we are all left to our own devices and morally abandoned by everybody. What humans are like over and over doesn't change too much. We differ from person to person, so some of us are more anxious and some of us are less anxious. I don't suffer from anxiety, and so I find I'm helpful to people who do. And because our bodies differ, our ethos is going to differ. Our habits of thought are going to differ. Right. And I like teaching Intro to Ethics for this reason, because my students, what have I got this semester? 150 students piled in to learn about Intro to Ethics, and they're all different individual bodies, right? Right. But what they learn in the course of taking Intro to Ethics is that no matter what ethic they practice, and there is 1 week a semester where I tell them to just pick any theory they're learning in my class and practice it for a week. And it doesn't matter what theory they practice. They all find out that if you practice any ethical theory for a week on purpose, it starts to form habits of thinking in your mind. They start thinking more often about how to be a good person and how to have a good life. And so, you know, their write-ups of their week of practicing in ethics start out with, okay, I'm doing this because you told me to, it's an assignment. And by the end of the week, they're saying, I went to the store and I found myself thinking about this project and thinking about how to be good and how to live well. Right. Good. That is the secret to ethics. It is that if you develop these habits of ethical thinking, they will kick in, even in times of stress, even when you don't expect them to kick in, because ethics is a habit. And I think what we find is, you know, we do not all panic, but at times when you could panic, if you've developed habits of thinking ethically, that will kick in even when you're feeling stressed. It's good news.
Yeah, that is good news. And something I just want to jump in on and ask you about, like just talking about, you know, your students practicing this and going to the store. So right now going to the grocery store is kind of like, you know, the social highlight for a lot of people. But I saw a story today about the fact that that's becoming a problem in some stores, that it is the one sort of form of social interaction people are getting, and then they're forgetting the social distancing stuff. But I was really struck by you talking about the idea that we need to teach this stuff, we need to live it and practice it. And in a sense, our political leaders right now are the teachers, right? Because they're holding daily press conferences and they keep reinforcing this, these various different practices, literal things that we should be doing every day, from washing our hands to, the physical distancing. And many of them, particularly in Canada, regardless of political stripe, are also talking about, an ethics of compassion, right? Like for the frontline workers, for, the people that are vulnerable. And so it's a big, large scale national and perhaps international modeling of how to live well, right, in this particular period. So I think that sort of makes sense of what they're doing to me in terms of what you're saying about they're trying to create. Is this a temporary period of ethical behavior, or do you think it draws upon the fact that we know how to do ethical behavior already in our everyday lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we are all extremely well set up to learn ethics. And I think in easier times, when there are fewer stresses upon us, or at least there are routine stresses that we've gotten used to, we sort of get out of the habit of thinking in a conscious way, in a slow, deliberate way. Right. How am I going to be good? How am I going to live a good life? And we sort of get into sort of fallback positions where there's not a lot demanded of us as far as thinking about how to be good in this particularly new and trying situation. So I think we're well constituted. We're all well constituted to do ethics. But if you get out of the habit of thinking about whether or not you're living up to your own personal ideals or personal identity, then in times of greater stress, it will challenge you to call on new habits of thinking that maybe you've let go. Maybe you have, right. I think of ethics a lot like New Year's resolutions. I'm a fan of resolutions generally, but right. You have to sort of keep yourself in the habit of reminding yourself that you have them, right? Otherwise, you forget that you have resolutions, you forget that you have ideals, and you figure, I'm probably doing well enough. I just need to get through this work day, this childcare, this doctor's appointment. And I think in times of stress, it's a way of reminding us, you have gotten out of the habit of thinking in more slow, deliberate ways about what it is you ought to do. Right. But that's why if you have habituated thinking of yourself as someone who is a helper, thinking of yourself as someone who's in relationships with other people, then those habits will make you more pro-social when the stresses are new and different. Right. And if you've sort of fallen out of that habit and you think that, what makes you you is having certain amounts of stuff, being alone with your stuff, then in times of stress and trouble, that fallback position will make you act less pro-social, and it will call upon you to try to think in a new and conscientious and different way.
Okay, so I'm wondering now, Kevin, whether it is our modern kind of bureaucratized state, right? That's what sociology deals with a lot of the time, that we have this modern system of running the economy and running public services like healthcare and education. So does it, in comparison, do you think historically it's just easier for modern states to kind of encourage this general ethical behavior? Because the periods that you study are where there are not really strong organizations of government, right?
Well, that's a great question, and there are and there aren't. For example, one of the things that this has made me reflect upon, both in terms of the current situation and historically, is that in epidemics, the state, the soundness and the health of the sort of social systems that you have going into the epidemic really loom large. Like the healthier you are going into the epidemic, the better equipped you're going to be able to deal with it. So and I think about that as an American living in Canada, and I think about the healthcare system here and the healthcare system down there, and where my family is. My family's in New York, but for example, in 16th, 17th century England, they actually do have a poor relief system, which is based upon raising taxes. They assess taxes, and they use those taxes to relieve the destitute. I mean, it's mainly just redistributing shillings, literally, just giving little bits of money and pensions to the elderly and that kind of thing. but that system is in place. So when plague hits, it's not surprising that that system is one of the ones that they are going to kind of build their plague infrastructure on top of, because they already have a bureaucracy for,
Right.
administering welfare and that kind of thing. Now that answer so far has really been about sort of bureaucracy and resources, but your question was about the teaching of ethics.
Right.
And, the church matters a lot, like
Right. Back in those times.
There is a huge institution which is teaching people in their daily lives a version of how to be good.
Yeah.
And so it does play a big role in the way, like, for example, if you're looking at a place like 16th, 17th century Europe, how they interpret and deal with and respond to the epidemic. So there are lessons teaching these folks that on certain levels, they are all in this together and they should be helping one another.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah.
Because, when I first got to Trent 10 years ago, I was asked to do a talk about the British petroleum oil spill. I was talking about the difference people have between their reactions between natural and technological disasters. And I was thinking the beauty of big institutions telling you how to be good. If the church or the state provides you notions of blame, responsibility, collective well-being, that's what the mental tool you fall back on. So in times of natural disaster, across the board, people seem to bind together more. In times of natural disaster, they tend to be a little more pro-social and compassionate. In times of technological disaster, they will run to their nearest mental tools. Like, somebody should be to blame for this. An individual should be to blame, or the state should be to blame, or the church should be to blame. So it's more complicated when it comes to those human-caused disasters, right? And the beauty and the horror of an epidemic is it's kind of both a natural and a technological disaster. And I think you're quite right that we end up falling back on the mental tools we've been provided. If we're provided the tool that there's got to be an individual to blame, then we'll look for them in times of technological disaster. Or if we're provided the mental tool that, we're all in this together, we should think of ourselves as one people, a collective. I was just reading about the 1871 siege of Paris. And the reason Parisians kind of like dug in and starved before surrendering is because they had come to see themselves as the people who are going to starve together rather than yield, right? So you fall back on the mental tool that the church or the state or your lessons provided you.
Yeah, and I think it's that's what brings us back to the first point about what resources do we have to deal with this generalized anxiety, right? And one of the tensions in a pandemic is that, of course, the resource we have to keep us safe and that we trust in is, the government and the health service and welfare in states like Canada, more so than in the US. But, Britain has that kind of system too. And Britain actually hasn't dealt with it as well as Canada in terms of, giving the public health experts, the kind of the lead. So I think that's the tension, is that, we have to trust in these expert systems. Most of the time, we don't have direct control, but it doesn't necessarily cause us problems because things work out all right. And then when it all falls apart, we're kind of like, oh, this is it seems to be the whole of our social existence. And then we have to, turn back to, actually, no, we can't panic and dismiss everything. We have to recognize that some of these systems actually are still working in our favor, and that's what we have to kind of hold on to. So I think that's been a really good discussion, and I think there's actually a lot more there that we could explore further another time as well. Do you two want to have any last minute thoughts or comments or encouragement?
I would just say,
people?
Yeah, I mean, to one of the things that Kathryn was saying before about people pulling together in epidemics, I would just say that while the history of epidemics does show all kinds of panic, anxiety, and blaming and prejudice and these kinds of things, we really don't see them descend into a Mad Max scenario, like time and again, like, we've seen episodes where, really quite frightening epidemics hit and a lot of people die and it's very scary. But, so far, the structures have held and society hasn't collapsed and people have tended to work together to get through it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. If I were to add anything, it would be that we're social creatures, right? We are inclined to look to each other. And that's why, because we are a variety of bodies, because we vary from the anxious to the not and the empathetic to the not so empathetic, that is actually why leadership from the top is so very important. We may differ in our embodiment, but we're all looking to each other. And if our leaders demonstrate compassion, a sense of identity with each other, a sense of that we're all in this together, we will follow. And if they don't demonstrate that, we'll be left to our own devices, or we'll follow the sort of lack of empathy they may demonstrate. I say this knowing I've got an elderly mother in the States. I've got a sister in the same city who's a doctor, and I hope she's okay. And her daughter, my goddaughter, has been accepted to University of Toronto in the fall, and I don't know what the fall holds for her.
Right.
So I'm hoping that the leadership they're getting in the USA is enough, that it's enough to make them feel like they can look to each other, they can look to their wider community. Good luck, Chicago. I hope you're okay.
All right. Yeah, and we send all our thoughts to all the communities struggling that we're connected to around the world, in fact, because Trent is so international, but also our local communities here as well. So I just want to thank you two again, and then I think we're going to reconvene relatively soon to do some more discussion, because this has been great.